Arizona Territory, 1881. The sun had barely crested the red hills when they turned her out with nothing but her baby and a basket of shame. Tessa Granger stood barefoot in the dust outside the little clapboard church, her arms wrapped tight around her newborn daughter. She had not cried when the pastor pointed to the door. She had not begged when the women turned their faces or when the man who fathered her baby sat silent in the first pew, eyes fixed on the floorboards. But when the church door slammed shut behind her, Tessa's throat burned. She had nowhere to go. The town of Dry Creek was small, tucked between bluffs and scrubland, and everyone knew everyone. She had worked at the mercantile before her belly showed. Now, no one would hire her. Not after what happened. Not after it came out that the man who had courted her in secret kissed her behind the schoolhouse and promised her a future was already engaged to the preacher's daughter. And now she had his child. She pressed a kiss to her baby's forehead. "You are not a mistake," she whispered. "You are mine." The wind kicked up dust along the empty street. Tessa started walking, unsure where she was going, just needing to move. She passed the saloon, then the blacksmith's, heads turning as she went. Some folks watched from porches. Others turned away. She kept walking. She would walk until her legs gave out if she had to. A horse whinnied nearby, and boots struck the ground behind her. "Tessa." She froze. The voice was familiar, low and rough like gravel, but steady as the morning sun. She turned slowly. He stood just off the road, reins in one hand, his hat in the other. Frank Zeller. He was a cattleman, worked a spread west of town. She had not seen him in months. Not since her belly had started to show. He looked the same broad shoulders under a dusty coat, dark brown hair curling under his hat brim. But his eyes held something she did not recognize. Not pity, not judgment. Something quieter, warmer. "You all right?" he asked. She swallowed. "They told me not to come back." Frank's jaw tightened. "Because of the baby?" She nodded. Frank looked at the bundle in her arms. "Boy or girl?" "Girl," Tessa said. Her voice cracked. "Her name's June." He took a step closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. "Can I see her?" Tessa hesitated, then loosened the blanket just enough for him to see the tiny face inside. June slept, her mouth open just slightly, one hand curled beneath her chin. "She's beautiful," Frank said. He looked back up at Tessa. "You got a place to stay?" She shook her head. "I was going to walk until I found somewhere." Frank frowned. "Come on." "What?" "Come with me. I have a cabin. It's not much, but it's warm. You look like you need a rest." Tessa stepped back. "Frank, I am not offering charity. I am offering a place where no one will look at you like you are dirt." She held June tighter. "You do not know what they said about me." "I do," he said. "I heard it all, and I still want you to come." Tessa stared at him. "Why?" His voice was steady. "Because you did not deserve what happened, and because I want to help." She looked at the road stretching behind her, the long miles of nothing. Then she looked at June. The baby stirred, her tiny mouth puckering. Tessa nodded. They rode double on Frank's horse, Tessa holding June close, the saddle creaking beneath them. The ride was quiet, the wind cool against her face as the town disappeared behind them. Frank's cabin sat in a hollow near a line of cottonwoods. There was a small corral, a lean-to for the horse, and a porch with a rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. He dismounted and helped her down carefully, his hands gentle at her waist. Inside, the cabin was clean and warm. A fire burned low in the hearth. There was a cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jars and folded linens. "I will take the cot," Frank said, already pulling a blanket from the shelf. "You and June can have the bed." Tessa looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" Frank met her eyes. "Because someone should have." She sat on the edge of the bed, June dozing in her arms. Frank handed her a cup of water. "You hungry?" he asked. "I will be fine." He waited a moment, then nodded. "I will be outside." When he stepped out, Tessa looked around the cabin again. It was small, but it felt safe. That night, Tessa stood by the fire while June slept in a basket beside the bed. Frank sat in the rocking chair, slow and steady. "I used to come to church just to see you," he said after a long silence. She looked up. "I never said anything. You were always with people. Then I heard what happened." He paused. "I wanted to say something, but I thought maybe I was too late." "You were not," Tessa said softly. He looked at her. "You still think about him?" She shook her head. "Not since the day he walked away from me in front of everyone." Frank stood. He walked to the fireplace, poked at the logs, then looked at her again. "I do not care whose child she is," he said. I care that you are safe. And I care that you are not alone. Tessa's throat tightened. I do not know what to say. You do not need to say anything. She looked down at June, then back at Frank. You are a good man. He smiled, just a little. I try. The night passed quiet, with the wind rustling outside and the fire crackling low. Tessa lay in the bed with June beside her, listening to Frank's slow breathing from the cot. For the first time in months, she felt like she could sleep. And for the first time in longer, she felt like maybe she was not ruined after all. Frank rose early, careful not to stir the baby. The cabin was dim, lit only by the pale blue light pushing through the shutters. Outside, frost traced the edges of the water trough and a thin mist hung low along the cottonwoods. He moved quietly, pulling on his boots and stepping outside with the bucket. The pump handle was stiff from the cold. As he worked it, water spilled into the pail in short, stuttering bursts. He filled it halfway and brought it inside, setting it near the hearth. A kettle already sat on the stones from the night before. Behind him, Tessa stirred. Her hair had fallen loose over her shoulder during the night, and she rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. June was still asleep, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek. I can do that, she said, sitting up. Frank shook his head. You need rest. I've got chores to tend. She stood anyway, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders. I can help. He watched her for a moment, then nodded once. There's eggs, and I left flour on the table. You'll find the skillet hanging by the stove. He stepped onto the porch again, letting the screen door ease closed behind him. The sun had started lifting above the ridge, warming the frost into beads of water along the fence rails. By the time he came back, the scent of cornmeal and eggs lingered in the cabin. Tessa had swept the floor and folded the blankets. June lay in the basket where Frank had once kept kindling, her eyes wide and following the flicker of flame in the hearth. Didn't think I'd ever see her awake, he said, setting down a bundle of kindling. She only stays that way for a little while, Tessa replied, watching June with a soft, tired smile. Then she goes back to dreaming. Frank crouched near the hearth, warming his hands. You cook like someone who's had to stretch rations before. I worked in kitchens when I was younger, she said. My father got sick one winter, and I had to take in laundry and cook for the ranch hands just to keep us in kerosene and beans. He glanced at her sidelong. Where was that? New Mexico territory. Outside of Socorro. What brought you here? She hesitated, brushing crumbs off her skirt. My uncle had a dry goods store in Dry Creek. I came after Pa passed. He said he'd help me get set up. Frank leaned back against the wall. That the same uncle who turned you out? She gave a slow nod. He said I'd shamed his name. Frank didn't reply right away. He watched the fire, fingers laced loosely across his stomach. I've got 2 milk cows, he said finally. They need tending twice a day. There's a garden plot behind the cabin, though it won't yield much till spring. I trade beef and tallow in town, sometimes take fence work jobs on neighboring spreads. Tessa looked over at him. You telling me how you make your way? I'm telling you that if you stay, you won't be under anyone's thumb. I'm not offering charity. You'd be part of the work here, same as me. Her eyes didn't leave his. And if I say yes, there's room for you. And for her. She looked down at June, who had started to gum at the corner of the blanket. You sure you want that? A woman with a child? A child that's not yours. I don't measure worth by shame someone else laid on you, Frank said. If you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Tessa didn't answer right away. She lifted June into her arms, rocking gently. The baby blinked, then nestled against her chest. I'll earn my place, she said finally. You won't have to keep proving anything to me. Frank gave a slow, quiet nod. All I want is honesty. Everything else can be figured. The afternoon passed with the rhythm of small tasks. Tessa washed linens in the basin, hanging them from a line strung between 2 cottonwoods. Frank built a new gatepost where the last had split, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. They didn't speak much, but their movements fell into step-passing tools, offering water, nodding when a task was done. That evening, as light fell soft across the fields, Tessa stood on the porch with June in her arms, watching the sun melt behind the ridgeline. Frank came up from the corral, arms streaked with dust, his gait easy. She's already asleep, Tessa said, glancing down at the bundle in her arms. She likes the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. Frank leaned on the porch rail beside her. I do too. For a while, they stood without speaking, the hush between them filled only by the rustle of leaves and the distant low of cattle. She's yours now, in a way, Tessa said, voice low. Frank met her eyes. Only if you want that. She nodded. Once? I do. He looked at her, really looked, and there was no hesitation in how he set his hand gently on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. She didn't flinch. The last of the light slipped behind the ridge, and the stars began to come out one by one, quiet as breath. By early February, the sky settled into a clear, brittle blue that held no promise of warmth. Tessa wrapped June in 2 layers of muslin and a wool scrap Frank had found in a trunk behind the shed. The child fussed when she wasn't held, so Tessa carried her against her chest in a sling she'd sewn from an old flour sack. She moved carefully through the morning frost, her boots crunching over stiff grass, the hem of her skirt damp with meltwater, steam curling from the cabin's eaves. Frank had gone out before dawn to check a heifer close to calving. When he returned, he unlaced his gloves slowly and set them on the table beside the door. She delivered just fine, he said. 1 white-footed bull calf. Strong lungs. Tessa looked up from the hearth where she was stirring a pot of hominy. You name him. Was thinking hickory. He's got a streak down his nose, looks like a branch split. She nodded once. That suits. He leaned his shoulder against the doorway, arms crossed. You still want to learn how to saddle? I said I did. His eyes softened. After breakfast, then. They ate in quiet rhythm, the scrape of spoons against tin the only sound between them. June slept, her breath light, and even beneath the sling. Outside, the sun had taken some of the bite from the air, though the wind still carried the sharp edge of high ground. Frank led her to the lean-to, where his mare, Clara, stood tied. He handed Tessa a blanket and showed her how to fold it over the horse's back, then lifted the saddle and waited while she positioned it with care. Strap's too loose, he said gently. She frowned, adjusted the cinch, checked it again. Better. Almost. Try pulling the latigo through one more time. Her fingers were stiff from cold, but she managed it. When she stepped back, he gave a single approving nod. They rode along the edge of the south pasture, where the land dipped into a draw thick with mesquite. Tessa sat straight in the saddle, her grip light but steady. June remained curled against her chest, sound asleep, lulled by the sway. Frank pointed to a spot where the fence had sagged. I'll need to brace that soon. Cottonwood posts don't hold well in the freeze. She shaded her eyes, squinting into the wind. I can dig if you mark the spots. He glanced over. You sure? I carried laundry for 20 families during an August drought. I can dig. They turned back before the sun dropped too low. As they dismounted, Frank reached for June. Let me. Tessa hesitated, then unknotted the sling and passed the baby to him. June stirred, blinked up at him, then yawned silently. She's getting heavier, he said. She eats like a grown man, Tessa replied, brushing hay from her sleeve. He rocked the baby gently. She's starting to look like you. She'll have my chin, poor thing. Frank laughed, low and rough. Nothing wrong with that. Later, Tessa stood at the table, shelling beans into a bowl. Frank worked beside her, sharpening the draw knife he used for shaping fence rails. Why haven't you married? She asked, not looking up. He paused, then set the blade down. After my brother died, I took over the land. Wasn't much time for courting. Most girls in town married by 18. I was still digging post holes. She tipped another handful of beans into the bowl. You ever come close? One woman. Years back. Her father didn't think I had enough to offer. She married a man with 400 head and a house with curtains in every room. Tessa's hand slowed. Curtains don't keep you warm at night. He looked at her then, steady. No, they don't. She brushed the last husk aside, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to face him. I don't have much either, she said. Just a baby and a name folks won't say kindly. Frank stepped closer. You have more than that. She didn't move away. What do I have? He didn't touch her, just met her eyes. You've got the kind of backbone most men wish for. And you know how to keep going when everything says you shouldn't. The wind rattled the shutters once. June let out a soft grunt in her basket, then settled again. Tessa swallowed. You think I belong here? I don't wonder about it, he said. I know you do. She looked down at her hands. I want something steady, not just a place to rest for a season. Frank's voice dropped. I'm not asking you to leave when the snow melts. She raised her eyes. Then what are you asking? He stepped forward, slow. I'm asking you to let this be home. For both of you, if that's what you want. She didn't speak right away. Then she nodded once, firm. I want that. The fire snapped in the hearth. Outside, the air had turned still. Frank reached for her hand, fingers rough with work, and she didn't pull away. They stood like that for a long moment, facing each other in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the light from the window softening the hard lines of winter. Nothing more needed to be said. Mid-March brought thawing mud and the sharp scent of wet earth. The cottonwoods along the creek behind the cabin were dusted with pale green buds, and the cows stood hocked deep in meltwater, lowing louder now that the worst of the cold had passed. Tessa stood at the clothesline with her sleeves rolled and her hands raw from lye soap, pinning the last of June's undershirts to the line. The baby lay nearby in a wooden cradle Frank had carved from pine, bundled in a quilt stitched from old shirts and flour sack ends. Frank returned from town with a bolt of muslin under one arm and a chipped enamel pan tucked beneath it. He set them both on the porch bench and knocked his boots free of the caked mud before stepping inside. I bartered some of the tallow for that muslin. Figured you might need it for new dresses. Tessa glanced up from the hearth where she was pouring hot water into a basin. I was thinking the same. June's outgrowing everything. Frank wiped his hands on his trousers. She's got your appetite. Tessa gave a faint laugh, setting the kettle aside. She's already trying to roll. I caught her halfway onto her side this morning. Frank knelt beside the cradle, brushing his knuckles gently against June's cheek. She's strong. She'll crawl before the month is out. Tessa wrung out a rag and dipped it again. How was town? He stood and leaned against the doorframe. Folks asked after you. She turned, stilling. What did you say? Said you're here. Said you're safe. That was enough. She studied him a moment, then nodded. And they accepted that? Some did. Some looked away. I didn't press them. Tessa folded the rag slowly. I don't expect them to change. I don't either, he said. But they can't touch what's here. She stepped toward him, hands drying on her apron. I don't plan to give them that chance. He looked down at her, something quiet but sure passing between them. You still want a life here, with me? I haven't changed my mind. Frank reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. I didn't want to wait for permission no one would give. Tessa's brow furrowed. What is it? He opened the pouch and held out a simple gold band, dulled at the edges but solid. Was my mother's. My father gave it to her before they crossed into the territory. I found it in a box with her letters. Tessa didn't reach for it. Frank, I don't want fanfare. I don't need a preacher's blessing. I just want to stand with you. Raise June with you. Build something steady. Tessa touched the ring gently with one finger. You sure? I've never been more. She looked down at the cradle, where June stirred, her legs kicking against the quilt. Then back at Frank. Then I'll wear it. He took her hand, slid the ring on slowly. It fit snug but not tight. She stared at it a moment, then met his eyes. I never thought I'd have this, she said. You deserve every good thing that comes now. That evening, she sat on the porch steps with June in her lap, watching the sun sink past the pasture. Frank returned from the woodpile with a split log over one shoulder. Tomorrow, we'll need to check the north fence line, he said. I saw signs of elk near the edge. I'll come, she replied. If I tie June to my chest, she won't fuss. He laid the log by the door and settled on the step beside them. You ever think about what you want down the line? Tessa looked out at the fields. I'd like hens again. Maybe a few rows of beans. And a second cradle if the time ever comes. Frank reached for her hand, calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. We'll have all that. And more. She leaned against his shoulder. June nestled between them, the three of them wrapped in the hush of coming night. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. The life they'd chosen was already unfolding slow, solid, honest, and it was theirs. April brought the first real warmth, the kind that softened the earth enough for planting. Tessa stood in the garden patch behind the cabin, her skirt hitched up to her calves, knees pressed into damp soil as she pushed bean seeds into the furrows Frank had carved with the edge of a hoe. June sat upright in a wooden crate lined with straw, chewing the ear of a cloth rabbit Tessa had sewn from leftover muslin. Frank had taken to marking the days on a scrap of ledger paper nailed beside the window, not for business, but out of habit, as if watching the days stack up on each other made them more real. He was fixing the last loose hinge on the barn door when he heard Tessa call. There's something in the peach tree. He stepped from the shadows of the barn, squinting toward the orchard line. What kind of something? Looks like a hawk got to it. Above the lower branches. Frank crossed the yard and studied the carcass of a squirrel tangled in the bare limbs. I'll take it down. Tessa wiped her hands on her apron. I'll fetch the shovel. He watched her walk back across the yard. The way her shoulders carried both ease and purpose now, not the brittle tension she'd worn the day he found her on the road. She had grown comfortable in this place, not just in her movements, but in the way she filled the silence between them without fear. That night, with the windows open and the scent of warm soil drifting in, they sat at the table sorting seed packets. Tessa held up a small envelope marked with faded ink. "Do you know what this says?" Frank leaned in, brow furrowing. "Radishes. Old script. My mother's hand. I found it in the bottom drawer. There were others. She kept her own seed stock. Said it was better than anything from town. Might still be true." Tessa smiled, folding the envelope back shut. "Then we'll plant them first." Frank reached for her hand, not in ceremony, but as something familiar. Her fingers slid into his as if they'd always belonged there. "I was thinking," he said, "about taking the wagon into Bisbee next week. There's a man there who does ironwork. I thought he might be able to make a proper cradle." Tessa looked toward the corner where June slept, her legs now too long for the basket. "She'll need it soon." He hesitated, then added, "And I'd like to have paper signed while we're there. Not because we need it, but because I want you to have my name." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she brushed her thumb against the inside of his wrist. "I'd like that." They left before sunup 5 days later, the wagon bed packed with salted meat, tallow, and a few lengths of hide to trade. June rode between them, wrapped in a shawl Frank's mother had once worn to winter gatherings. The road to Bisbee wound through dry gullies and past cottonwoods just beginning to leaf. They camped overnight near a stream, and Frank built a fire that threw soft light against the canvas of their lean-to. Tessa watched the flames, June asleep against her chest. "Do you think your mother would have liked me?" Frank stirred the embers with a stick. "She'd have liked the way you don't flinch when things get hard." Tessa glanced down. "I used to. You don't anymore." The next afternoon, they stood in the rear office of a man who kept a copper scale on his desk and ink on his sleeves. Tessa signed her name steady and clean, without hesitation. Frank followed, and when they stepped back into the sunlight, the weight of it settled, not heavy but sure. They didn't speak of it on the way home. There was no need. It was done, and it belonged to them now. By midsummer, the garden had taken root. Radishes pushed up through the dirt in tight rows. June had begun crawling, pulling herself along the floorboards with surprising determination. Frank had built her a pen from scrapwood and lined it with a quilt so she could watch them work without rolling into the hearth. One morning, Tessa stepped into the yard with a bucket of wash and paused. Frank was kneeling by the fence, adjusting a length of wire, but it wasn't that which caught her eye. It was the peach tree. Small, hard fruit clustered along its branches, pale and green now, but full of promise. She crossed to where Frank worked, setting the bucket down. "There'll be peaches this year." He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "First crop in 4 years. I'd like to keep some for preserves," she said. "And a pie. I haven't made one in a long time." Frank nodded. "You'll have every peach you need." That night, they sat on the porch with June asleep between them. The stars hung low and clear, and the wind carried the scent of the fields. Tessa leaned her head against Frank's shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this settled." "You made it that way," he said. "This place was just wood and ground until you came." She reached for his hand. "It's home now. For all of us." He kissed her forehead, his breath warm against her skin. And beneath the cottonwoods, with the baby dreaming soundly and the fields full of quiet, they stayed like that, wrapped in the kind of peace that doesn't come easy but holds firm once it arrives. A peace earned, not granted. Their life together stretched ahead, not without labor, but with nothing left to fear. Just hands held, work shared, and love that had grown slow and true like roots deep in the desert ground.